They say everyone has a price, but they never tell you the cost of a failed hit. My name does not matter anymore, because in the streets of Harlem in 1968, I was just a ghost with a cold piece of steel in my jacket. I was offered $1 million. Think about that. In today's money, that is a fortune, but back then it was enough to buy the world and everyone in it. The target was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The world knew him as Bumpy, the godfather of Harlem, the man who walked among lions and never got scratched. I sat in the back of a dim cafe on 125th Street, watching the rain blur the neon signs outside. My hands were steady, but my soul felt heavy. Why did I take the job? Because when the five families put a price that high on a man's head, you do not say no. You either take the money or you become the next target. It was a suicide mission, and I knew it. Bumpy was not just a man. He was an institution. He fed the poor and broke the bones of the greedy. He was the law when the police were too afraid to show their faces. I checked the cylinder of my .38 special. 6 rounds. 6 chances to end a legacy. The plan was simple. Bumpy always ate at the Wells restaurant. He felt safe there. He thought his people were his shield. He thought his reputation was a bulletproof vest. That was his first mistake. My mistake was thinking he was mortal like the rest of us. As I walked toward the restaurant, the air felt thick like I was breathing underwater. Every shadow looked like a bodyguard. Every siren in the distance sounded like my own funeral march. I walked through the door, and the smell of fried chicken and expensive cigars hit me. And there he was, sitting at a corner table, alone. He looked older than the photos, but his eyes were like 2 black holes burning through the room. He did not look like a gangster. He looked like a king waiting for his crown to be taken. I felt the weight of the $1 million in my mind. I thought about the life I could have. A beach far away. No more blood. No more hiding. I reached into my coat. My heart was a drum in my ears. I stepped forward. 1 step. 2 steps. The world slowed down. I saw him look up. He did not reach for a gun. He just looked at me with a strange kind of pity. I pulled the trigger. The sound I expected was a thunderclap that would echo through history. But the only sound in that crowded room was a dry metallic click. A misfire. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Bumpy did not blink. He slowly put down his fork and stood up. He looked at the gun in my hand, and then he looked me straight in the eye. I pulled the trigger again. Click. Nothing. I felt the blood drain from my face. My legs felt like lead. The $1 million vanished. The beach vanished. All that remained was the man in front of me and the cold realization that I was already a dead man walking. Bumpy took a step toward me and smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. He leaned in close and whispered something that made my skin crawl. But I did not know yet that the worst was still to come. The metallic click of the hammer falling on a dead primer was the loudest sound I had ever heard. In a room full of people eating and laughing, time simply stopped. My finger was still frozen on the trigger, cramped and white-knuckled. I looked at the gun. I looked at the man. Bumpy Johnson didn't dive for cover. He didn't scream for his guards. He just stood there, tall and steady, like an old oak tree that had weathered 1,000 storms. His eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with a terrifying, cold disappointment. It was the look a father gives a son who has failed a simple test. My heart was slamming against my ribs, so hard I thought it would crack a bone. I pulled the trigger a 3rd time. Click. The universe was mocking me. $1 million was resting on a firing pin that refused to strike. I saw his bodyguards moving in the periphery of my vision. 2 massive shadows rising from a nearby booth, but Bumpy held up a single hand. Just 1 palm. And they stopped. They actually stopped. That was the power he had. He owned the air in that room. He took a step closer, close enough that I could smell the expensive tobacco on his suit and the faint scent of peppermint. He didn't grab the gun. He just leaned in until his lips were inches from my ear. The restaurant had gone deathly silent. Even the kitchen staff was peering through the swinging doors. "You should have checked your equipment, son," he whispered. His voice was smooth, like velvet over gravel. "Whoever sent you didn't care if you lived or died. They gave you bad silver." I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. I was a professional, a man who had ended lives from the docks of Jersey to the alleys of Brooklyn, but in that moment, I felt like a child. He reached out and gently took the revolver from my hand. I let him. I couldn't have held on to it if I tried. He opened the cylinder, tipped the gun, and the 6 heavy rounds slid out into his palm. He looked at them, then looked at me. "These bullets are older than you are," he said, his voice rising just enough for the whole room to hear. "They sold you out before you even walked through that door." One of his men, a guy they called Junie, stepped up and pressed the cold barrel of a suppressed pistol against the back of my neck. The sting of the steel made me shiver. I closed my eyes, waiting for the dark. I thought about that $1,000,000 again. What a joke. You can't spend money when your brains are scattered across a checkered tablecloth. But the shot never came. Bumpy looked around the room, making eye contact with every witness, every terrified patron. He was putting on a show. He was reminding Harlem who the king was. He turned back to me and dropped the useless bullets onto the floor. They rattled like dice. "Take him to back," Bumpy ordered. "But don't break him yet. I want to know who held the purse strings for a $1,000,000 failure." They grabbed me by the arms, dragging me toward the kitchen. My heels scuffed the floor. I looked back one last time and saw Bumpy sitting back down, calmly picking up his fork as if nothing had happened. He began to eat his greens again. As they threw me into the dark, cramped office behind the pantry, I realized something that chilled me more than the gun at my neck. The Italian families didn't just want Bumpy dead. They wanted me to fail. They wanted a war, and I was the spark. I sat in the dark, my hands tied behind a wooden chair, listening to the muffled sounds of the restaurant dying down. An hour passed, maybe 2. Then the door creaked open. It wasn't the bodyguards. It was a woman I recognized from the neighborhood. She was crying. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and pure, unadulterated terror. "He's coming for you now," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "But he's not alone. There's a man outside from the Lucchese family. He says he's here to collect his property." In that moment, I realized I wasn't just a failed hitman. I was a bargaining chip, and the trade was about to turn bloody. The door swung wide, hitting the wall with a thud that echoed like a cannon shot. Bumpy walked in, followed by a man in a sharp gray suit I had never seen before. The man in the suit smiled at me, but it was the smile of a shark. He looked at Bumpy and said, "The million is still on the table. Johnson, all you have to do is let me finish what this amateur started." I looked at Bumpy, praying for a quick death, but what he said next changed everything. Exactly then, the true horror of the situation began to unfold. The room felt like it was shrinking. On one side stood Bumpy Johnson, the man I had just tried to kill. On the other, a representative of the Lucchese family, the very people who had put the gun in my hand. I was sitting in the middle, tied to a chair, sweating through my shirt. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and the metallic tang of fear. Bumpy looked at the man in the gray suit. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He pulled out a pocket watch, checked the time, and then looked at me. It was as if I was a piece of meat being weighed at a butcher shop. The man in the suit, a high-ranking soldier named Sal, stepped toward me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh box of ammunition. He began a slow walk around my chair, the floorboards groaning under his expensive leather shoes. "You see, Bumpy," Sal said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "This boy was supposed to be a professional. We paid for a masterpiece. Instead, we got a comedy of errors. The bosses aren't happy. They want a refund, and they want this loose end tied up." Bumpy leaned against a heavy oak desk. He lit a cigar, the smoke curling around his head like a crown. "And why should I let you do that in my house, Sal? This kid tried to take my life. In Harlem, that makes him my property, not yours." Sal stopped walking. The smile vanished. The tension in the room rose until I thought my heart would stop. "The $1,000,000, Bumpy. We leave the money on the street. It's yours. A gift for the inconvenience. Just let me take him out to the alley and put one in his ear." I looked at Bumpy, pleading with my eyes. I wanted to scream, to tell him that they had set us both up. But my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. I realized then that I wasn't a person to them. I was a transaction, $1,000,000 for my life. It seemed like a fair trade for a man like Bumpy. Bumpy took a long drag of his cigar and exhaled slowly. $1,000,000 is a lot of money, Sal. It could buy a lot of peace, or a lot of war." He walked over to me. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. I flinched, expecting a blow, but he just gripped me tight. He looked at Sal, then back at me. You told me earlier that whoever sent me didn't care if I lived or died. I finally managed to croak out. My voice sounded like breaking glass. You said they gave me bad silver. If you give me to him, you're proving them right. Bumpy silenced me with a look. He turned to Sal. I've decided. The money stays. But the boy stays too. Sal's face went red. You're breaking the rules. Bumpy. The commission won't like this. You're protecting a rat who failed. I'm not protecting a rat, Bumpy said, his voice turning into ice. I'm keeping a witness. You say the bullets were old. I say they were tampered with. I think you wanted him to fail. I think you wanted a reason to bring your army into my streets while I was busy burying my own body. The silence that followed was deafening. Sal reached for his waistband, but before he could even touch leather, 3 of Bumpy's men had their guns leveled at his chest. It was a stalemate that could end in a massacre. Bumpy stepped closer to Sal, pressing the glowing tip of his cigar just inches from the Italian's face. Go back to your bosses. Tell them the million is a down payment for the trouble they're about to have. And tell them if I see another suit in Harlem tonight, I won't bother with old bullets. Sal backed away, his eyes darting between the guns pointed at him. He looked at me one last time, a look of pure, venomous promise. This isn't over, kid. You're a dead man no matter whose shadow you hide in. He turned and slammed the door. I exhaled, my whole body shaking. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Bumpy didn't look at me. He didn't untie the ropes. He just looked out the small, barred window at the dark streets of Harlem. Don't thank me yet, son, he said quietly. I didn't keep you alive because I like you. I kept you alive because you're the only one who can tell me exactly which door in the Bronx I need to kick down tonight. He turned around, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of real rage in his eyes. We're going for a ride, he said. And if you lie to me once, I'll give you back to Sal myself. But I'll make sure you can't walk when I do it. As they dragged me out to the black Cadillac waiting in the rain, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, leaning against a lamppost across the street, was the woman who had been crying in the kitchen. She wasn't crying anymore. She was holding a radio, and she was watching us with a cold, calculated stare. That was the moment I realized the betrayal went much deeper than the Italian mafia. The car door slammed shut, and as we pulled away, I saw the headlights of 3 SUVs pull out for the shadows behind us. The real nightmare was just beginning. The leather interior of the Cadillac smelled of expensive cologne and gun oil. Bumpy sat in the corner, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights like a stone monument. I sat next to him, my wrists still raw from the ropes, watching the 3 sets of headlights in the rearview mirror. They were gaining on us. Who is she? I asked, my voice trembling. The woman at the restaurant. She was signaling them. Bumpy didn't turn his head. Her name is Mary. Her brother died in a turf war 2 years ago. She blamed me for it. I thought I was helping her by giving her a job. I forgot that in this city, grief is a poison that never leaves the system. One of the SUVs sped up, pulling into the lane next to us. The window rolled down. I saw the glint of a submachine gun. Get down, Bumpy roared. The world exploded in a hail of glass and lead. The passenger side windows shattered, showering us in diamonds of light. Bumpy's driver, a man of iron nerves, didn't scream. He just swerved the heavy Cadillac, slamming into the side of the SUV. The sound of grinding metal screamed through the night. I scrambled to the floorboards, pressing my face against the carpet. I could hear the rhythmic thud of bullets hitting the armored door. Bumpy wasn't hiding. He had pulled a snub-nosed .38 from his waistband and was firing back through the broken window with a calm, surgical precision. Return fire, he shouted into a radio. From the car behind us, his own soldiers opened up. The street became a tunnel of tracers and fire. We were tearing through Harlem at 80 miles an hour, a rolling war zone. I looked up and saw Bumpy's face. He looked alive. For the first time, the boredom was gone. He was in his element. They don't want you, kid, Bumpy yelled over the roar of the engine. They want the million back, and they want my head to show the commission they can take Harlem whenever they please. The SUV we hit lost control, spinning out and slamming into a row of parked cars. It flipped, a twisted wreck of fire and screaming rubber. But the other 2 were still there. And they were smart. They separated, one staying back, the other trying to cut us off at the intersection of 7th Avenue. We're being funneled. The driver grunted. They got a roadblock up ahead. Bumpy cursed under his breath. Turn into the alley on 130th. Now, the driver yanked the wheel. The tires shrieked as we drifted into a narrow, dark passage between two tenements. It was barely wide enough for the Cadillac. The brick walls scraped the sides of the car, throwing sparks like 4th of July. We screeched to a halt at the end of the alley. It was a dead end. A massive iron gate blocked the way, locked with a heavy chain. Out, Bumpy commanded. We piled out of the car, just as the headlights of the remaining SUVs turned into the alley. We were trapped. 6 of Bumpy's men formed a line, their long coats flaring as they drew their weapons. I stood behind Bumpy, my heart hammering. I had no gun. I had nothing but a front row seat to my own execution. The SUVs stopped 20 yards away. The doors opened. Sal stepped out, flanked by a dozen men. He was holding a Thompson submachine gun, a wicked grin on his face. Nowhere left to run, Bumpy, Sal shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Give us the boy and kneel, and maybe I'll make it quick for you. Bumpy stepped forward, standing in the middle of the alley. He didn't look like a man cornered. He looked like a man about to deliver a sermon. You brought a lot of boys for a man's job, Sal, Bumpy said, his voice echoing with a terrifying authority. Did you tell them they're dying for a lie? Did you tell them the Lucchese family already signed their death warrants the moment they crossed the line into my territory? Sal laughed. Your territory? Look around, old man. You're in a cage. Is that what you think? Bumpy asked quietly. Suddenly, a whistle pierced the air from the rooftops above. I looked up. The silhouettes of dozens of men appeared on the fire escapes and the roof ledges. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing the clothes of the neighborhood. Laborers, veterans, young men with nothing to lose. And they were all holding rifles. Sal's grin vanished. His eyes darted upward, his face turning the color of ash. This is Harlem, Sal, Bumpy said, his voice a low growl. I don't need an army when I have a city. The men on the roofs didn't wait for a command. They opened fire. The alley turned into a slaughterhouse. I dove behind the Cadillac, covering my ears. The noise was deafening. Screams, gunfire, the shattering of windshields. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, the SUVs were riddled with holes. Most of Sal's men were down. Sal was leaning against his car, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in agony. Bumpy walked toward him, his boots crunching on the spent shell casings. I crawled out from behind the car, my legs shaking. I thought it was over. I thought we had won. But as Bumpy reached Sal, a shadow moved in the darkness of the doorway next to them. It was Mary. She wasn't holding a radio anymore. She was holding a small, silver Derringer. She wasn't aiming at Sal. She was aiming at the back of Bumpy's head. Bumpy! I screamed. The shot rang out, but in the chaos, I couldn't tell who had fallen. Everything went black as something heavy hit me from behind, and the last thing I heard was the sound of a woman's laughter. The world came back in flashes of red and gray. My head was throbbing, a dull, rhythmic ache that felt like a hammer hitting an anvil. I was back on the cold pavement of the alley. The smell of burnt gunpowder was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. I blinked, trying to clear the haze from my eyes. A few feet away, Bumpy Johnson was on one knee. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Mary's shot had grazed his temple, carving a jagged red line through his skin. He looked dazed, his legendary composure finally cracked. Mary stood over him, the small silver Derringer shaking in her hand. Her face was a mask of pure, distorted grief. You took everything from me, she screamed. Her voice echoed off the damp brick walls like a ghost. My brother was just a boy. He didn't deserve to die for your numbers game. Bumpy looked up at her, his breathing heavy. He didn't reach for his gun. He just looked at her with that same haunting pity I had seen in the restaurant. Your brother made a choice. Mary, he said, his voice raspy. In this life, the choices we make are the only things we truly own. I tried to move, but my hands were zip-tied behind my back now. Someone had searched me while I was out. I looked around and realized the army on the rooftops was gone. They had vanished into the shadows of Harlem as quickly as they had appeared. Only Bumpy's core inner circle remained, and they were busy disarming the survivors of Sal's crew. Sal was still alive, slumped against the wheel of his wrecked SUV, watching the scene with a bloody grin. "Do it, girl," he wheezed. "End the legend. End the king." Mary's finger tightened on the trigger. I could see the knuckle turning white. This was it. The $1 million contract was about to be fulfilled by a grieving waitress with a $5 pistol. "Wait," I shouted. Everyone froze. Mary turned her eyes toward me. They were hollow, empty pits of despair. "He didn't kill your brother," I lied. The words came out in a rush. I saw it. It was the Lucchese family. They used your brother as a decoy to get to Bumpy's routes. They're the ones who put him in the line of fire. It was a desperate gamble. I didn't know if it was true, but I knew Sal's face. The moment I said it, Sal's grin flickered. Just for a second. But a second was all Bumpy needed. With a burst of speed that defied his age, Bumpy lunged forward. He didn't strike Mary. He gently grabbed her wrist and pointed the gun toward the sky. The second shot went harmlessly into the night air. He wrapped his arms around her as she collapsed into a fit of sobbing, the gun falling to the asphalt with a dull thud. "Take her home," Bumpy whispered to one of his men, "and see that she has everything she needs. No more blood tonight." He stood up, wiping the blood from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He walked over to me and sliced the zip ties with a pocket knife. He didn't thank me for the lie. He didn't even look at me. He walked straight to Sal. Sal looked up, his eyes wide with the realization that the game was over. Bumpy reached into Sal's jacket and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound notebook. The ledger, the names of every dirty cop and every bribed official the Italians had on their payroll. "This is worth much more than $1 million, Bumpy said, flipping through the pages. "This is the keys to the city." He turned to me then. His eyes were cold again, the pity gone. "You saved my life twice tonight, kid. Once with a bad gun, and once with a good lie. Does that mean I'm free?" I asked, hope rising in my chest like a flare. Bumpy looked at the ledger, then at the burning wreckage of the SUVs. "Freedom is a heavy word, son. You know too much now. You've seen the king bleed. You've seen how the stitches are held together." He gestured to the black Cadillac, which was idling at the end of the alley, its headlights cutting through the smoke. "We're going to the docks," he said. "There's a boat waiting. It'll take you as far as the coast of Jersey. From there, you run. You never look back. You never mention the name Bumpy Johnson." I nodded, my breath hitching. "Thank you." But as we walked toward the car, Bumpy stopped. He looked at the ledger one last time and frowned. "Something is wrong," he muttered. He turned the page to the very back. There, written in fresh ink, was a list of names under the heading, "The Final Phase." The first name on the list was Bumpy Johnson. The second name was mine. But it was the third name that made Bumpy's hand shake. It was a name that neither of us expected to see. A name that meant the war wasn't just coming. It was already inside the house. Bumpy looked at me, his face pale in the moonlight. "We aren't going to docks," he said, his voice trembling for the first time. "We're going to my home." The truth was finally coming out, and it was more terrifying than any hitman's bullet. The drive to Bumpy's townhouse was the quietest 30 minutes of my life. The city outside was waking up, the first gray light of dawn touching the rooftops of Harlem. But inside the Cadillac, it felt like a tomb. Bumpy stared at that third name in the ledger. His thumb traced the ink as if he could erase the betrayal by touch alone. The name was Mamie, his wife. I felt a cold hollow opening up in my chest. Mamie was the heart of his operation, the woman who kept his secrets and balanced his books. If she was on a list of people to be removed by the 5 families, it meant the foundation of Bumpy's world had turned to sand. We pulled up to the brownstone. Usually, there were 2 men at the door. Tonight, there was no one. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging in the morning breeze with a rhythmic, ghostly creak. Bumpy didn't wait for his guards. He stepped out of the car, his movements heavy, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the crown had finally become too much to bear. I followed him. I don't know why. Maybe I felt I owed him a death, or maybe I just couldn't look away from the wreck. We walked into the foyer. The smell of expensive perfume was replaced by something sharp and metallic. Blood. We found her in the study, slumped over the very desk where she had managed the finances of Harlem for decades. She wasn't dead, but she was fading. A single shot to the side. Mamie, Bumpy whispered, dropping to his knees. She opened her eyes, struggling to focus. Ellsworth, she breathed. They came. They said you were already gone. They told me if I didn't sign the transfers, if I didn't give them the codes to the Swiss accounts. Bumpy took her hand. His face was a mask of agony. Who, Mamie? Who came here? She looked past him, her eyes fixing on me. For a moment, I thought she was going to point at me, the failed hitman. But her gaze went further, to the doorway behind us. The man who walked in wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a hitman. He was wearing a police captain's uniform. He was a man Bumpy had paid for 20 years. A man who had eaten at Bumpy's table and walked his kids to school. It's over, Ellsworth, the captain said, his voice devoid of emotion. The Italians didn't want you dead. They wanted you bankrupt. And you're the last person to realize that the era of the Godfather is over. The corporation is taking over now. Bumpy didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even look up. He just kept holding Mamie's hand as her breathing slowed. How much? Bumpy asked. Enough to retire, the captain replied. Enough to forget I ever knew your name. I stood in the corner, a ghost witnessing the fall of an empire. I realized then that the $1 million they offered me wasn't meant to be paid. I was just a distraction. While I was fumbling with a jam gun in a restaurant, the real hit was happening here, in the heart of his home. They used my failure to move Bumpy out of the house so they could strip him of his only true asset, his legacy. The captain looked at me. You kid, you're the only witness left who doesn't have a badge or a throne. He raised his service revolver. I closed my eyes. I had escaped the restaurant, the alley, and the highway, only to die in a quiet study at sunrise. But the shot never came. Instead, there was a heavy thud. I opened my eyes to see Bumpy standing over the captain. He hadn't shot him. He had hit him with a heavy bronze bust of Shakespeare from a desk. The captain was out cold on the floor. Bumpy looked at me. His eyes were dead. There was no fire left, no kingly aura. He looked like a tired old man who had lived one day too long. Go, he said. What about you? I asked. Bumpy looked down at Mamie. She had stopped breathing. He gently closed her eyes and sat in the chair beside her. He picked up his cigar, which had gone out long ago, and placed it in his mouth. A king doesn't leave his palace during a coup, he said quietly. He waits for the end. I backed out of the room, my heart heavy with a truth I could never tell. I walked out into the Harlem morning, the sun finally breaking over the horizon. I had no money. I had no home. I was a man who had been paid $1 million to kill a legend, only to find out that the legend was already dead. The news the next day said Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in his home. They said he died peacefully, surrounded by his memories. They never mentioned the captain, the ledger, or the girl with the silver gun. I moved to a small town in the Midwest. I work in a garage. I never touch a gun. But every time I hear a metallic click, a car door closing, a light switch flipping, I freeze. I realize the ultimate truth that morning in Harlem. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't a hitman with a gun. It's the silence that follows when the world decides you're no longer needed. I still have one of the bullets from that night, the one that misfired. I keep it in my pocket to remind me that sometimes a failure is the only thing that keeps you human. But the truth is, I never really escaped that alley. I'm still waiting for the hammer to fall.